Thank you, Anat. Good afternoon, and thank you all for joining us today for Dark Money, the Hidden Enablers of Crime and Global Exploitation. In today's timely discussion on financial transparency and international corruption, we are joined by Brooke Harrington, Rick Messick, and Gary Kalman. Brooke Harrington is a sociology professor at Dartmouth College whose research focuses on studying offshore financial systems and the people who run them. As part of her research, Brooke trained as an international wealth manager, fully immersing herself in tax havens and banking centers worldwide. That research has informed her many articles, as well as her recently published book, Offshore, Stealth Wealth and the New Colonialism. Rick Messick is founder of the Messick Group, where he consults for international organizations, development agencies, and NGOs on legal and development issues. Prior to the Messick Group, Rick worked for the World Bank on anti-corruption in legal and judicial reform, and prior to that served as chief counsel of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. His writings have appeared in the Wall Street Journal and the Washington Post, and he maintains the Global Anti-Corruption blog at globalanticorruptionblog.com. Gary Kalman is the executive director of Transparency International US, an NGO focused on combating global corruption. Gary is also the founding member of Financial Accountability and Corporate Transparency Coalition and is an advisory council member of the International Coalition for Illicit Economies. His writings on global corruption and transparency have appeared in The Guardian, The Financial Times, and numerous other publications. Thank you all for being here. Gary, let's kick it off with you. So, the Corporate Transparency Act was passed several years ago on bipartisan grounds. But recently, the Trump administration rescinded a portion of the act covering U.S. citizens. What is the CTA? What is the administration's rationale for the move? And what are the potential impacts going forward?
Sure, and thanks for the question. And it's good to see so many friends and colleagues out in the audience. So just to take a step back, up until recently, it was legal and common for companies to form in the United States without naming who was actually behind them, who were the beneficial owners, those people that benefited from the actual company's proceeds. And the problem is that, in the words of from some of my colleagues in Global Witness, that became the getaway vehicle for bad guys, right? Just to give two quick examples, which I always find sort of startling, is after we put sanctions on Iran, it took years for us to discover that they had secretly set up companies and bought property in Manhattan on Fifth Avenue. Just think about that for a second. The easiest and safest and best place in the world to evade our economic sanctions is by buying property on Fifth Avenue. The second one, which in some ways may even be more scary, is when we were in Afghanistan and the Defense Department decided that it wanted to provide services to the troops that were in Afghanistan. So they contracted with a U.S. company that had operations in Afghanistan. It turns out that company was secretly owned by the Taliban. We were literally giving money to an organization that could use those monies to buy bullets and fire at our troops. So these are the kinds of nefarious activities. Tons of stories about drug cartels and other transnational criminal organizations that use anonymous companies. So it was through bipartisan agreement we would get rid of them. Signed in the very last days of the Trump administration with the support of the Trump Treasury Department. So we thought we might be safe going into this new administration. Unfortunately, while members of the Treasury still supported the bill, as Michael said, unfortunately, the Trump administration essentially gutted the bill by exempting all US-based companies. Right? So the only companies that are required to now report their true owners would be foreign companies operating in the US. But if those foreign companies set up an LLC in Delaware, then they too would be exempt. So we are assuming that the only people that actually will be reporting under the new regime are incredibly stupid or companies companies that have nothing to hide. But even they, I think, still might decide that it's just safer to set up a U.S. shell company. This all happened despite the fact that there still maintains bipartisan support Law enforcement was very strongly in favor. There are some in the small business community that raised some privacy concerns, but unfortunately, apparently, and there's an article in New York Magazine today or yesterday that just came out saying that because of a tweet that was tweeted at, or X, or whatever you call it these days, was posted at Elon Musk, saying, hey, this is a violation of the privacy, this is a bad regulation, you got to get rid of it. He responded by saying, yes, I will look into it, and then 3 days later they came out with this new sweeping exemption. We are in the process of talking with members of Treasury and the administration, with law enforcement, which does have some sway with this administration, to hold on to at least the basics of the law, and maybe we will fight to live another day. But right now, it's essentially gutted.
Thank you. So it does seem, sticking with the CTA, that there are banking regulations that demand that when someone sets up a bank account for an LLC in the U.S., that they have to disclose the beneficial owner. Is there any overlap between that and the rescinded portion of the CTA, or are there gaps now that the rescission is in place?
So,
and anyone, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, real quickly, and then if people have things to add. There are two different requirements, right? For different reasons. Banks do collect this information. That is a true statement. But they don't necessarily turn it over to law enforcement. And so there are gaps there. But even more importantly is if I am using a foreign bank, and I set up a Delaware, I have a Delaware LLC, but I use a Cayman bank or a Dubai bank, then there's no beneficial ownership information anywhere in the United States, or actually anywhere in the world. So the CTA closes critical gaps. We would not, for example, have known about the Afghanistan company or even the Iranian company because they set up companies here, but they used offshore banks. So huge gaps, easy to get around unless you have this information being collected on all U.S. companies.
And remember, the banks, even the U.S. banks, aren't particularly aggressive when it comes to questioning beneficial ownership. They do a very superficial job, and the evidence they do a superficial job is the several $1 billion in fines U.S. banks have paid for violating the AML Know Your Customer rules. And, you know, how many billion? They must be making a lot of money if they can pay billions of dollars in fines.
Sure. So we brought up offshore accounts a few times already. Brooke, as someone who's extensively studied the offshore world, how are offshore accounts used, and are there any reasons that have surprised you in your research?
I wouldn't call them offshore accounts. They're structures, kind of like Legos. Anyone here remember playing with Legos when you were a kid? And how you can take very simple, basic blocks and make anything with them. Well, there are only 3 basic blocks of the offshore world, and that's the corporation, the trust, and the foundation. But they can be combined in infinite varieties of customizable structures depending on what the client needs and wants. So people talk about offshore as if it's just about the game of dodging taxes, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. I wonder if it would surprise you to know that the biggest users by volume of money of the offshore financial world come from countries that don't impose taxes at all, like Saudi Arabia or the UAE. So why do you reckon they're using the offshore system? Anybody want to guess?
Think terrorist.
Nope. The offshore system sells secrecy. That's what it sells. Tax evasion is one manifestation of that, but there are a whole suite of things that you might want secrecy for. If you want to be the finance minister of Dubai at some point in your life, you have to at least appear to have complied with Sharia laws intricate financial regulations, which means it makes it very hard to participate in the modern financial system because it's haram or forbidden to lend money at interest or borrow money at interest. And yet you want your Ferrari and you want your chateau in France, and you have to keep up with the Joneses, who are other billionaires. So what you do is you get your fortune, or a portion of it, offshore, and you have your trustee or your wealth manager buy those things in their own name. You are merely the beneficial owner. You enjoy them, but you're not technically the owner, and so technically your hands are clean, and you can rise to a position of political power in a country where religious compliance is very important. Or perhaps you want your daughters to inherit equally with your sons. For that too, you've got to get your money offshore. Perhaps you anticipate a messy divorce. Russian oligarchs are legendary for pulling this game on their wives of 20, 30 years. My colleague here, Alex Cooley, who is a political scientist specializing in the post-Soviet space, he probably knows the names of some of these folks. Yeah, discretion. Discretion is the better part of valor when talking about Russian oligarchs. There was a man, the phosphate king, one of the original, the OG oligarchs. I'm blanking on his name right now. But he was one of those fellows who'd been married to wife number one for 20 odd years. And he approached her with the delicate suggestion of a post-nuptial agreement. And she was like, I know what you're up to, buddy. Get out of here. So he just went behind her back and put much of his billions into offshore trusts. But she wasn't having it. So he was going to run off with his mistress and enjoy the fruits of his ill-gotten gains as the phosphate king of Russia. And she dragged his butt through court in Switzerland for 10 years with all the money in the world and the best lawyers in the world. It took her 10 years to prove the beneficial ownership connection between two offshore trusts and her soon-to-be ex-husband, so she could get, maybe 40% of that money. That offers you a big clue as to why wealthy people all over the world like to use the offshore system, because it imposes extreme transaction costs on anybody who wants a piece of that money. Are you all familiar with the concept of transaction costs, or is that too sociological?
Oh, no.
Okay, good.
They
good,
better
good.
be. If they're here and they don't know transaction costs, leave right now. You're not going to get an MBA.
I didn't know if people still taught new institutional economics and Douglas North and all those kind of folks. But the name of the game offshore is secrecy and imposing enormous transaction costs on the discovery of information. And that's useful if you want to skip out on your debts, whether it's to a divorcing spouse, or very popular one is borrowing money from banks or other rich people. Guess what? Rich people don't just make sport of not paying their taxes. They make sport of not paying back their debts either. And they use offshore for that. In fact, I have a friend who is a very high-end lawyer from London who's essentially a high-end debt collector, like Dog the Bounty Hunter, but for rich people with private jets. He was featured in the Wall Street Journal back in 2017. His name is Daniel Hall, and he works for a company called Burford Capital. And if you're a rich person who has made a big loan to another rich person, perhaps as a part of a business partnership, and the other guy wants to screw you out of what he owes you, and has been evading that debt, Daniel and his team will chase that person down, among other things, by looking at their social media posts. Because even though these people buy secrecy, they cannot help themselves from engaging in status competition. They're all over Instagram bragging about smoking cigars in the smoking room at Claridge's in London or what have you. And that's when Daniel pounces and sends a process server before they can run off to their private jet and leave the jurisdiction. Anyways, that's a long answer to your question.
No, that's amazing. So it's not really as much about shielding from taxes, right? We normally think of this concept of tax havens, but we have FATCA now and things like that, which essentially means the IRS can look through into U.S. account owner structures worldwide. That's what I was going to ask. Do tax havens even still exist as we conceptualize them?
And Switzerland, oh gosh, I hate to say this, it's going to be taped. And I'm giving a talk in Switzerland. Well, okay. There are some people who say Switzerland has been particularly vigorous about cracking down on money hidden in Swiss banks as a result of corruption. Mubarak, the Mobutu Sese Seko of Zaire, more recent Gulnara Karimova from Uzbekistan, right? So the Swiss are on the cutting edge of getting corrupt money flushed out of their system. Try to get, if you're a tax agency in in an OECD country, try to get information, and you'll find tax violations in Switzerland are not criminal, they're administrative, and you will not get to square one. And some people suggest, I don't know this for a fact, that the reason is, while there's this much corrupt money in Swiss banks, there's that much tax evasion money. So we'll go after the corrupt money. Just, the tax thing, well, you have to understand, Switzerland is Switzerland, and it's not really a crime to evade taxes in a foreign country. In Switzerland, it's an administrative violation, which is an entirely different matter. That's at least what some people say.
Okay, thank you. Going back to some recent changes in the U.S., the Trump administration also said recently that it would no longer enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which historically has barred U.S. corporations from bribing foreign officials in jurisdictions where it was common practice. What do you think the impacts to companies, consumers, the public at large will be of this change? And have we seen anything already?
Me?
Whoever wants to take it.
Well, let's be clear. The pause in the enforcement of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act is a pause. It's for 180 days. It's extendable for another 180. The purpose of the pause is to determine whether the way it is currently enforced advances U.S. economic interests. And the reason I'm going to speak to Switzerland Attorney General or Chief Prosecutor in a couple of weeks is to generate information during this 180-day pause. The Attorney General is gathering facts to determine whether indeed the way the law has been enforced, it is in America's economic interest. Now, if multiple people put facts before the Attorney General, send her a letter, 918 Constitution Avenue, 20043, the Honorable Pamela Bondi, and say, here's the facts I know, and they show it's in America's interest. Then at the end of the 180 or 360 days, we see, gee, the enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act has advanced American economic interest. She might ignore the facts. Remember, the administration works in an alternative fact universe. But the real facts could be put before a federal judge to say, you can't change the way it's enforced because it'd be irrational given what's the facts on the record. So that's the pause is unfortunate. And Gary, you told me something interesting last night about that. But the real name is, I'm hoping that I'm sort of trying to stimulate law enforcement, retired law enforcement, American businesses, to say, look, this law has been in America's best interest, and don't stop enforcing it the way you're enforcing it. But that was a great piece you picked up.
We probably have a little bit of a different take on this. I think that, first of all, I do want to be clear, both with the Corporate Transparency Act and with the FCPA, the administration is doing things that the administration can do. We've had a number of confusing calls from reporters because people keep saying it's been repealed. No one's repealed either of these laws. They haven't gotten it through Congress. And so we've sort of approached some of this when we started with this administration, that benign neglect of some of this stuff would be a win, right? Because you can come back to fight another day. So just to be clear, that hasn't been repealed. So this is their enforcement. They have a right to make decisions about what they enforce and what they don't. I think this is a bad decision. But what the impact of the FCPA decision is going to be, we think perhaps, while it's terrible, is perhaps less than what some people might fear. And the reason is this. First of all, the FCPA has a statute of limitations of 5 years. Some people, for some, depending upon how it is, it could be 6 years, which means that if I bribe somebody tomorrow and there is a new administration in 4 years, that administration can come back and prosecute me. So it's not a free pass. The second thing is that I have spent collectively, well, businesses collectively have spent billions of dollars developing FCPA compliance teams, mechanisms. They understand the countries in which they operate, some of which are quite challenging jurisdictions, corrupt jurisdictions. They're not dismantling that because in 4 years they'd have to put it all back together, which not only would be expensive, but you'd probably lose the talent that you had that knows specifically about the countries that you in particular are operating in. When we spoke to the Chamber of Commerce and several large multinational businesses, this is sort of the worst of all possible worlds. And let me just, to be very blunt here, repeal of the FCPA would be great for them, so they say. Enforcement of the FCPA that is consistent and clear and they can plan for it, second best option. Least best option is we don't know whether this is going to be enforced or not. We don't know exactly what it's going to be enforced, prioritizing intersections with drug cartels and transnational criminal organizations. By the way, transnational criminal organizations is not actually defined. And so if you bribe an official and that official is in Zambia but sets up a Delaware shell company to launder their money, that is now a transnational crime. Is that a transnational criminal organization? Perhaps. So you have absolutely no idea how the law is going to be enforced and whether or not you're going to be on the wrong side of a tweet that gets you in trouble. Therefore, you are most likely going to, you may not be as diligent because 3 levels down in your supply chain there might be a bribe and you're not worried about that. But I don't think there's going to be a complete stepping back of the FCPA sort of acknowledgement amongst multinationals. The other thing I would say is there was also recently an announcement, France, Switzerland, and the UK formed a task force to step up their enforcement of their foreign bribery laws. We'll see how serious that is. We don't know yet. It's brand new. But again, it adds uncertainty. And I'm personally of the opinion that this kind of risk and this kind of uncertainty, the lawyers for these companies are not saying it's free rein, do whatever you want.
But the big point you told me last night that I took away, I do some training with business executives about how to deal with requests for a bribe, right? But you have to, in order to have a compliance program that, if a business has a program that genuinely tries to prevent employees from paying foreign officials a bribe, and some employee goes off the reservation and pays a bribe, the business can either not be prosecuted or get a minor fine if they say, gee, we had a compliance program and we're doing our best to keep all our thousands of employees from paying a bribe. And you have to, part of the things you have to do training, and you go out and you do these scenarios with executives, and one of the standard scenarios is, you know, Mr. Public Official, there's this really serious law in the US called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and I'd go to jail for years and I'd be fined. And so much as I'd like to pay you a bribe and my company would like to pay you a bribe, my hands are tied. Well, now, thanks to this pause, how good an excuse is that? Oh, well, the Bondi's not enforcing it. I want my bribe money. And it's going to put business executives, yeah, right?
Let me say one other thing is we were proud to have played a role recently in the last couple of years in also passing a new anti-bribery law called the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act. So the FCPA punishes the company that pays the bribe, but the public official that asked for the bribe, nothing happens. And so there's a couple of problems with that. It turns out some studies were done, and I believe 80% of the officials that took bribes, and these are senior officials, this isn't the cop on the street asking for $20 to get out of a ticket. This is multi-million-dollar bribes of ministers of the interior and presidents and what have you. 80% of them never get held accountable in their own country. And so we passed a law that says if you try and extort a U.S. person, business, what have you, that the U.S. can come after you. And so that law, interestingly enough, was not in the executive order. It was mentioned in one of Pam Bondi's memos, but in the executive order saying we're pausing the FCPA, there was no mention of pausing the Foreign Extortion Prevention Act because that's going after foreign officials, it's not going after the U.S. companies. And so if somebody asks a U.S. business for a bribe, or if somebody says, by the way, I'm not going to ask you for a bribe, but I'm going to take the bribe from the Chinese company, and so therefore you don't get the contract, you've now impacted U.S. commerce. And we could still go after you. So again, there are things in place that I think create an enormous amount of risk for companies and now for the people asking for the bribes. Have we solved bribery in the world? No, don't misunderstand me. Companies are going to pay bribes and people are going to ask for bribes. But I don't think it's going to be open season the way some people think. This is probably the most hopeful amongst all the sort of difficulties and challenges that we're facing that I would say. We'll see. I could be wrong, but I'm maintaining some hope.
That's interesting. So as we think about enforcement, right, and we think about maybe a federal government that's taking a step back, is there room for state governments to come in and fill the gap at all? Rick, I think maybe you wrote some of this similar in your blog.
Every state has a law against bribery, okay? The question is whether the jurisdiction of the court reaches payment by a multinational that perhaps has little or no contact with the state, and there's a rule that you have to have minimum contacts with the state in order for the state to exercise jurisdiction over your activities. So there's the question of what state, New York presumably, and then the question is what about, is it in foreign commerce? Individual state laws vary on the extent to which they criminalize that kind of conduct. I should add that I interviewed the lawyer that was at the Securities and Exchange Commission for the early years of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. And I asked him, I think there'd been like 20 cases in the first few years, and I asked him, was there ever a case where the bribe taker was prosecuted? And he said, well, we had cases where the bribe taker was subsequently promoted to minister, right? And we had one case where we had to, it was an African country, we had to go ask the government not to execute the bribe taker, at least until we settled our case against the bribe payer. But he said, of course, in that one, the bribe taker had been a government official and then voted out of office or kicked out of office, and the existing government was going to execute him for taking a bribe. You know, in many countries that is okay. And they had to intervene to just hold off executing the guy. So we've had complaints and complaints and complaints about the failure of the countries where the bribes are taken to do anything at all about these people. And the OECD's published this report, and we have tried advocacy. The World Bank, for a while, when it would catch a company that paid a bribe under a World Bank finance contract, would then send a referral to the country where the bribe taker resided, and nothing happened. And for a while they would report every 6 months, gee, we sent a referral to the government of Bangladesh, and it's been now 6 months, nothing happened. It's been a year, nothing happened. And after, I don't know, it was some of the reports, which after 6 years, nothing had happened. And it was so embarrassing to the countries that were continuing to borrow money from the World Bank, who hadn't prosecuted bribe takers, that the bank stopped publishing. Yes, the bank stopped. Gee, it wasn't good for our, public relations image.
So thinking about, informal mechanisms for enforcement, Brooke, you recently spoke on NPR that people caught using offshore accounts to dodge taxes or avoid creditors can maybe be shamed into compliance. Can you expand on that, and are there any instances where it's worked?
Probably the most surprising thing I found for me in 17 years of studying the ultra-rich and how they use the offshore financial system is that they're just incredibly thin-skinned people. So, a lot of us marvel, for example, at how vengeful people like Elon Musk and Donald Trump are, or Peter Thiel for that matter. But they are not outliers, they're the norm. And I saw case after case of that. The wealth managers I spoke to were very frank about their clients' vindictiveness and the fact that instead of riding off into the sunset with their billions and just enjoying them, they care very deeply about what other people think of them. So it's not quite accurate. When you hear people say that the ultra-rich are shameless or shame no longer exists, that isn't quite true. I think we've lost a lot of the shared norms that used to be in place to shame people. So, for example, when I was born, it was still considered very shameful for a child to be born out of wedlock. And now it's very common and no big deal. So norms change over time. And we've lost some of the shared cultural norms that may have been prevalent over the entire United States decades ago. But that does not mean that the rich are incapable of feeling stigmatization. They absolutely are, and you see it all the time in their behavior. So I think that's a force that we can use because it doesn't require much money or any money at all. And it's something that people in civil society can use judiciously. Now, I'm not suggesting witch hunts or cancel culture, although, it is worth noting that when the first sanctions started to land on Russia in March of 2022, the thing that got Vladimir Putin out in front of television cameras threatening to nuke Europe it wasn't the economic sanctions. It was the EU merely discussing the possibility of refusing to grant tourist visas to the teeny tiny fraction of Russian elites who have a foreign travel passport. That's what got Vladimir Putin talking about cancel culture and railing about nuking the West. Oh, that and European orchestras refusing to play Tchaikovsky.
Well, now we're really talking serious stuff, right?
Yeah.
Really talking.
Yeah, act of war. So we can use this. We should use this. It's very important that, if at all possible, we not, start dropping bombs on each other or shedding blood. What we have to find out, and I think this is where sociology has a lot to contribute to this conversation, is what the pressure points of stigmatization actually are. Like, one thing we've discovered over the last couple of years is it used to be shameful to be called a hypocrite. That's gone. That's over. Doesn't work anymore on anyone. But being called, an incel or being told that like girls don't like you for a certain class of, honestly, for a certain class of broligarch, that's like garlic for vampires. It works. And so what sociology can help us do, because one of the things that sociologists do is we study norms and stigma and how those work or don't work on different social groups. we can pinpoint, what exactly are the cloves of garlic we can use to get these people to back off and maybe start obeying the law. Because I would contend that rich people have not fundamentally changed as human beings in the last, say, 400 years or 450 years since the Medici were bankrolling Michelangelo. The Medici weren't better people than Elon Musk or Peter Thiel, but the Medici were subject to different social norms, and they were subject to things that they cared about, like reputation, especially their reputation as God-fearing Catholics. Because if they were credibly accused of being usurers, and that was a one-way express elevator to hell for them. And they cared about that then. Hardly anyone cares about it now. But there are still things we can use to leverage the ultra-rich and pull them back into a mode of behavior that is less antisocial, or maybe even at the margins, pro-social.
I have to say, I sympathize. Great research, please do it. But remember, there's going to be one class in the world that is beyond hope: bankers. Bankers have no shame whatsoever. And if just look at the amount of money they've paid in fines for AML sanctions, et cetera, they have no shame whatsoever.
I published a whole paper about this. And
Do they have shame?
I'm not sure if I should say I regret to inform you that they do. They do, but perhaps not in the way that you think.
Was it a representative sample?
Well, there's no way to know. Not that many bankers work in the world of offshore finance, but the ones that do, my God, the resentment they carry about being unable to go to cocktail parties and hold their heads high when people ask them, so what do you do for a living? So, either the second to last or third to last James Bond movie featured a Swiss banker as the bad guy. I got such an earful about that from wealth managers and how just goddamn unjust that was. And how, they couldn't, these bankers who serve the ultra rich in the offshore world, it really angered them that they couldn't go to parents' night at their kids' nursery school and tell people what they did for a living without getting the stink eye or the wagging finger. So at an individual level, they care about the reputation of their industry. Now, admittedly, offshore wealth management, offshore banking is a subset of banking.
Okay.
But those people in the offshore world, they care a lot about reputation.
Because I'm sort of always been skeptical to opposed to the death penalty, but in recent years I've thought banks should be subject to the death penalty, and certain of the senior executives as well. And that's the only way we're going to get this under control. But I'm heartened to know there might actually be.
Does anyone in MBA programs still teach about the fact that the corporate death penalty is a thing that exists? That it is possible to revoke the charter of incorporation for a misbehaving company? Way back in the day,
This was like 10 years ago?
300 years ago, after the first really big financial scandal in history, the South Sea bubble in the UK. Anyone here take financial history? Remember? So, a scenario not unlike what's happened with President Trump hawking Tesla stock. George III, then the King of England, got behind and pushed to the public the idea of buying shares in a largely notional undertaking called the South Sea Company. This was early in the days of globalization and colonization. And of course, there wasn't transatlantic travel very readily, or transatlantic media. So you could make up the most fanciful story about all the gold and other riches you were going to find in the New World, and wouldn't you like to buy a share, British public? George III got behind that. It turned out to be a complete scam, and it crashed. In fact, Winston Churchill's great-great-grandmother, Sarah Spencer, was one of the smart ones. She cashed out her South Sea bubble shares early, made a fortune, and that became the fortune that sustained old Winston a couple hundred years later. But After the South Sea bubble exploded and like bankrupted probably 50% of the UK population, the UK outlawed corporations for about 100 years. They just didn't come back. You couldn't have a corporation. Except by very rare charters, like Dartmouth, where I teach, was chartered by the king as a special favor. But that power still exists as far as I know. You can execute misbehaving companies. You can tell banks, you no longer have a charter to operate. We're taking it away. But nobody ever uses it. Maybe we should start using it.
We tried. We went to the New York banking supervisor over Credit Suisse and the Mozambique hidden debt scandal. And there was a huge scandal involving loans to poor country Mozambique. And two senior executives of Credit Suisse were deeply involved. And Credit Suisse was not admitting liability, and those cost the country horrible billions of dollars in losses. And we actually, if you want to do business as a bank in the US, you got to do business in New York. And the New York banking supervisor, Financial Services Administration, I think it's called, and it was somebody who knew AOC, and we went through AOC's office. Nope. They weren't going to put Credit Suisse out of business in New York, which essentially made them out of business, for the catastrophic effect on the world financial system. Credit Suisse ultimately paid $400 million against the $12 billion or so of damages the country suffered as a result of the wrongful actions of the executives.
That's chump change for them.
It was chump change, and it certainly didn't get anywhere near the extraordinary damage that did to the citizens of Mozambique.
Well, thank you both for that answer. I'll have to bring oligarchs into my lexicon. I really enjoyed that. In our last few minutes here, I'd like to open up to Q&A from the audience. Does anybody have? Sure.
Hey, how's it going? I'm not an MBA student. I'm an international policy master. So I'm Sandeep. Nice to meet you. You talk about ego and thin skin being a motivator and a way to nudge the rich.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
Like, I'm like, eye contact, I didn't do this, my bad. I keep thinking about Trump and I keep thinking about the tariffs and this, I'm watching my stocks sink and sink and sink. And I have a few friends who wonderfully shorted Tesla and I'm really jealous. But he talked about the stock market the entire time his first thing. It was like, oh, the stock. Why isn't this enough of a motivator for his reputation, for his friends, for anything? Or, I mean, is there a way here to nudge things one way or the other as, the global trade order crashes around us? To say,
Yeah.
maybe this is bad for your reputation or your...
So, yeah, you're right. Clearly, Trump's calculus has changed between his first term and his current term. And that is one of the things I find most alarming. I think there's a fairly straightforward explanation for that, which is, since we know that he's very transactional, it's like, who's paying him today? Who put him in office? Those people, like, I can't prove this, and I hope I live long enough to find out if this actually happened, but just empirically observing his behavior, what I would infer from that is that the people who put him in office, which is to say probably some Russians, definitely the broligarchs, and definitely a bunch of crypto bros as a subspecies of the broligarchs, they handed him a to-do list saying, okay, we're going to put you in office and keep you out of prison, but here's your honey-do list. Here are like our top 5 priorities, now go do them. And he has been moving with zest and alacrity through that list. And it's clear that one of the list items is crash the economy and deflate the value of the US dollar.
And destroy the world trade system, the world trading system, and in the process, right?
Yeah. In particular, I think the global alliances part of that is important to the Russians because the power of the United States to sanction bad actors comes from not just the power of our economy as a standalone thing, but our trade alliances globally. And so what Trump is doing is sort of the economic equivalent of pulling us out of NATO. He's destroying our economic alliances. Who's that good for? Cui bono? Well, we can think of some sanctioned countries and individuals that would benefit from that a lot.
Now, I can see I'm not as worried because at the conference, there's a whole session to explain exactly what Trump is, why he acts, and it will be, and Brooke has given part of it, but
The conference was planned in the summer. We didn't know.
but she's added this secret panel to explain everything about Trump. But you all have to come. It won't be broadcast. It won't be online. So you have to attend the conference if you want to know exactly what makes Donald Trump tick.
It's like ordering a double animal style at In-N-Out Burger. You know, it's all the good stuff is off the menu.
Okay, we have time for one last question.
Couple of, Chris, thank you, I'm honored. Also, the topic is dark money. Should we be more concerned about what's happening in the dark or about systems in place that happen right in front of us? For example, I want to move away from Mr. President Trump and just talk about the system. So we know who's supporting presidential candidates through the PACs and all of these other open ways of influencing government. So which one is more important, the dark ones or the ones that are in front of us?
He's made his living fighting dark money, so he's got a bias here.
Well, but I think it's actually a really good question, right? I'm maybe a little bit less certain that there are super PACs and what have you that are funneling foreign money into the system. I think it's actually harder than you think. It has become sort of a norm where most people that are paying attention, if you will, do understand that a lot of the campaigns for our elected officials are funded by interests that are not necessarily just, oh, this is what I think, right? So you have the Citizens United decision, which allowed for a lot of corporate money to flow into the system. We know all that. And I'm not sure that, well, let me say it this way. I think we have become somewhat numb as a population that I don't know that there's a lot of voters that heard, oh, either on the left, George Soros is funding a candidate, so I'm going to vote against that candidate, or the Koch brothers are funding somebody on the right, and so I'm not going to support that candidate. I feel that there's so much large-scale special interest money going into the system, we've come a little bit numb. And when we talk to folks overseas, the phrase, legalized bribery is a fairly common response. So we do need to make sure that we know what kind of money's going in. I'm not suggesting that because as Rick noted, I've spent a good portion of my life trying to make sure that this money is, there's not opacity in the campaign finance system. We were making some progress. We've had some setbacks. But I do think that what is out in the open needs to be challenged. And if we were to spend all of our time going after just the dark money in our political system, I think we would be missing the larger picture of the money that is out in the open that we do know about, that is going uncontested. And if we don't think that has an impact, I think we're missing the larger story. So I think it's a good question. But I would focus on the money we do know about.
Well, Gary, Rick, Brooke, thank you so much for being here. That brings us to time. Thank you all. Thank you.